We'd like to now begin the Q&A section. We have a couple questions that have been posed by participants that we'd like to address. The first question is for Dan. In discussing the evaluation and validation of components of Educator Evaluation Systems, Dan, how might states validate the components of their new systems? What might states do to validate new teacher and principal evaluation measures?
So one can tackle this at different levels. I will point people to the Passing Muster Brookings paper that I mentioned in the chat as the way that you can formally evaluate the system and see if it's looking like it's doing what you want it to do. But I would also say that on a sort of a less technical level, that you should look for sort of the face validity of the system. And I'd look for two things. The first is, does it look like differences in performance are driven solely by particular components? That suggests to me that some of the components aren't doing what you would hope that they would be doing. If a component says all teachers are the same, then I think you have to wonder at a high level, why are we doing this? It's costly to get people to go in and do classroom observations, and all the observations say that the teachers are the same. It's not clear that that's a useful thing to do in that case. And then the other thing is, and this comes up in the context of a lot of times with teachers who are in value-added and non-value-added areas, if it turns out that there's much greater differentiation in value-added areas, for instance, than non-value-added areas, well, you might think that, let's say, teachers are rated more highly outside of the value-added grades and subjects, that the teachers outside value-added grades and subjects are just better. I mean, that's one plausible explanation for that finding. But the other plausible explanation is that people are not differentiating as much as they need to. And I guess I would argue that if you found that dichotomy in evaluation ratings, that suggests that the evaluation system is not credible kind of across the board.
Great. So it sounds like states should definitely look at their data, look at the results, even districts or even at a campus level, to review outcomes and then investigate any anomalies or interesting things that come out of the review of those data.
Yeah, and I don't want to take too much more time, but I just want to say really quickly, something that states and districts should be doing is collecting the individual components from individual teachers. So in some places, that is not happening, that districts, for instance, just aggregate to the school level or to the district level what are the summative ratings of teachers, and then that will get passed on to the state. If that's the system, we will never be able to learn from the variation at a state level. We'll never be able to learn a bit from the variation that exists between teachers.
Great, thank you. So looking at component level and even components within an observation rubric rather than the overall score. That's great. And that's something that I think districts and states could easily do if they do collect that data. You don't necessarily need sophisticated data analysis to examine trends and distributions.
Yep.
Great. Okay, I have another question for Ohio. Ohio, you mentioned a lot of the lessons learned and discussed some feedback that you would receive from pilot participants and then how you address that feedback. So how might states and even school districts capture that type of implementation feedback from the field to inform the design and implementation of their system? So what methods did you use to capture that feedback from the field?
This is Carolyn. We actually had basically third-party entities doing those evaluations and the studies of the pilot groups that did the performance side of the growth component, and then later pilots did the student growth measure side. And I think having that third party do that evaluation and the report out, you get a lot truer information as opposed to us as a state agency asking you, how did this go? What worked? What didn't work? The third party works much better than the state agency itself doing that, because people are in the local agency, they're in the local entity, they're much more comfortable to talk to somebody who's not representing the state. They're outside of the state agency. So I think that would be the biggest piece of advice that we would offer there.
Great. And are you familiar with the methods those organizations use to capture feedback? Did you all conduct surveys, focus groups, interviews?
They did all of the above.
Great. Excellent. So, and I know that speaking from personal experience here at the REL Southwest, we are actually working with the Texas Education Agency to help them collect feedback and evaluate the first year of the state's pilot. So definitely for those of you who work with districts or state departments, if you don't necessarily have the funds, if you don't have Race to the Top or additional funds to hire an external evaluator, definitely be creative and reach out to your RELs, to your comprehensive centers around the country, and see if there are ways that you can work with those types of organizations to evaluate your systems. Great, thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time for Q&A. There were a number of comments that were posed within the discussion question section of the webinar, the pod, and it looks like a lot of those have been responded to already, and those will be archived as well. Also, someone had asked if we could compile all of the links that were shared within that webinar pod, and we will include those within the archived materials. Now go ahead and turn it over to Jackie.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to all of our presenters. We had presenters from across the country with us today, sharing very rich content and detailed information with us that we'll all be able to use in our work. And we do invite you to complete our stakeholder feedback survey. We also want to thank all of our participants for being so engaged and staying on the webinar. It's always a delight to see almost all of the participants stay till the very end. We do appreciate that. And I am putting the link to the stakeholder feedback survey. It should open up on your computer so that you can complete it right now. It's very important for our learning that you complete this, and if for some reason the link didn't show up, you can email me, Jackie Bernitzky, and I can provide that to you in an email. Otherwise, we're going to sign off, and thank you everyone for your participation today.